There is a very important person that I forgot to thank this morning, and it's been bugging me ever since. You see the image that we're using for the whole conference. It's one part of a mural that was created by an artist called George Litachevsky. And it was something that was produced for Garage for an exhibition called Art Experiment that happened at the beginning of this year. And it was talking about the history of museums in Russia. So I want to say thank you to him because he gave us the graphic that we needed so badly for this conference. So session one is going to involve 3 speakers giving 20-minute presentations, and then we'll have a discussion. And the theme is loosely about the future museum and the relationship between public and private partnerships, initiatives, kind of looking at what's possible without necessarily taking the kind of structure that public or state is one type of thing and private is another, because as we all know, there's many boundaries that are now blurred between these terms and between the ways that museums operate. So I'm going to just do the biographies for the 3 speakers now, so that they can just come up one after the other, and we can get moving through the presentations. So Christian Rattemeyer joined the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2007 as the Harvey S. Shipley Miller Associate Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints. I'm glad I'm just called Chief Curator. From 2003 to 2007, he was the curator at Artist Space in New York, and previously he worked for Documenta 11 in Kassel, Germany. Vasily Zeratelli, was appointed the executive director of the Moscow Museum of Modern Art in 2002. He's held positions as the Russian Culture Ministry's commissioner of the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Biennial, and numerous others, including as a member of the organizing committee of Moscow International Biennial for Young Art. Jack Persekian is the director and head curator of the Palestinian Museum and the founder and director of Anadiel Gallery and the Al-Mamal Foundation for Contemporary Art in Jerusalem. His previous positions include director of the Sharjah Art Foundation, artistic director of the Sharjah Biennial, and head curator of the Sharjah Biennial. And this all kind of ranged from 2004 to 2011. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Christian. And as before, we'll have the presentations and then we'll have a discussion. So get your questions ready.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's conference. Thank you, Garage. Thank you, Anton. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Moscow. I think moments of contemplation and speculation, analysis and correction are vital for all institutions, and I hope I can contribute in the next couple of minutes a little bit with some basic remarks on the history of the Museum of Modern Art. I want to send a few concessions and caveats in advance. I'm by no means a specialist on the history and the programmatic evolution of the institution that I represent here today. And my participation has more to do with my role in its current research in the regions of Eastern Europe rather than my work on MoMA's past. So I hope you will take everything that I say and that you hear from me with a grain of salt, with some skepticism, and with the understanding that it represents a very, very, very incomplete and in many ways very personal take on a history that is much more rich, more complex, and intellectually more influential than I could possibly represent here and do justice to. Also, I know that Kate has given me a brief to speak about MoMA's organizational form, and in preparation for that, I spoke to many people sort of on the legal and organizational side in my institution, and I've come to learn that many of the specificities of MoMA are very much tethered to very specific conditions of the American tax code, American organizational conventions, and so on. And I think that those kind of things really are of no use because they cannot be applied anywhere else. So I will not speak so much about MoMA's sort of organizational intricacies, but instead will focus on about the first 10 or 15 years of MoMA's history, and will show cursorily a number of images and talk about a number of projects that hopefully can correct some of our sort of biases or ideas or maybe conceptions and misconceptions about what the Museum of Modern Art is, or what it represents, or what it could be, or what it once was. When talking about MoMA, there are many different paths one could choose. Here we go. For many in the world, MoMA represents a very complicated idea, a model, maybe a success story, certainly an outstanding collection, a formidable player in a certain reading of the history of modern art, even one could argue a primary author of that history itself. This history is not always universally shared, and not everyone understands it as one's own. So I want to consider today 3 ways of looking at MoMA, to come closer to the enormous influence and successes it has had in the field of modern art, and to formulate the challenges that result for us, its staff and its audiences today, in our attempt to continue its relevance. The first is simply enough a history of MoMA as a place, a physical place. The second, probably one of the shorter ones, looks at MoMA as a program, what we might call its definitive capacities to shape the ideas of how a history of modern art is told. And the third look of MoMA is what I would call MoMA as a prism, a viewing device through which a surprising amount of diversity has been absorbed and presented and recontextualized, and that represents the wild and untamed side of the museum, one that is often forgotten or not told. I hope that here we might find some inspirations to think more adventurously, to think broadly, or just weirdly and strangely about the things that constitute our world. Let's begin. How does this work? There we go. In the late 1920s, 3 progressive and influential patrons of the art, Lily P. Bliss, Mary Quinn Sullivan, and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, perceived a need to challenge the conservative policies of traditional museums and to establish an institution devoted exclusively to modern art. Along with additional original trustees Conger Goodyear, Paul Sachs, Frank Crowninshield, and Josephine Crane, they created the Museum of Modern Art in September 1929. Paul Sachs was a professor at Harvard, and one of his graduate students, PhD candidates there, was a young scholar named Alfred H. Barr Jr., who was called upon to become the founding director of the museum at age 27. And he intended the museum to be dedicated to be helping people understand and enjoy the visual arts of our time, and that it might provide New York with, quote, the greatest museum of modern art in the world, end quote. This is just the foundational charter. I want to say a few things. New York was a very backward place when it came to modern art in the 1920s. Modern art, that is. The first time modern art, European modern art, was shown in New York in 1913 at the Armory Show, and it had not resulted in a proper museum to represent that living art in New York. So unlike Russia in the 1920s, which was extremely advanced and extremely diversified, and as we learned earlier in Maria's presentation, extremely sort of specific about the various ideas of what a museum for modern art could be. New York had none of those conversations, so MoMA filled a very, very vital gap. As you see in the charter, the museum was incorporated as an educational institution under the New York Board of Regents for the Department of Education. It is a public benefit nonprofit corporation, so it's a company of sorts. It is not a foundation, it's a corporation, albeit one that serves the greater public good. And I want to read you the current version of the museum's mission statement, and I will read this without further commenting on it. But I hope it presents some of the core issues that are at the core of our thoughts, and I think will hopefully make you aware of some of the language in it. And I quote in its entirety. Founded in 1929 as an educational institution, the Museum of Modern Art is dedicated to being the foremost museum of modern art in the world. Through the leadership of its trustees and staff, the Museum of Modern Art manifests this commitment by establishing, preserving, and documenting a permanent collection of the highest order that reflects the vitality, complexity, and unfolding pattern of modern and contemporary art, by presenting exhibitions and educational programs of unparalleled significance, by sustaining a library, archives, and conservation laboratory that are recognized as international centers of research, and by supporting scholarship and publications of preeminent intellectual merit. Central to the Museum of Modern Art's mission is the encouragement of an ever deeper understanding and enjoyment of modern and contemporary art by the diverse local, national, and international audiences that it serves. To achieve its goals, the Museum of Modern Art recognizes that modern and contemporary art originated in the exploration of the ideals and interests generated in the new artistic traditions that began in the late 19th century and continue today. That modern and contemporary art transcend national boundaries and involve all forms of visual expression, including painting and sculpture, drawings, prints and illustrated books, photography, architecture and design, and film and video, as well as new forms yet to be developed or understood that reflect and explore the artistic issues of the era. That these forms of visual expression are an open-ended series of arguments and counter-arguments that can be explored through exhibitions and installations and are reflected in the museum's varied collection. That it is essential to affirm the importance of contemporary art and artists if the museum is to honor the ideals with which it was founded and to remain vital and engaged with the present. That this commitment to contemporary art enlivens and informs our evolving understanding of the traditions of modern art. That to remain at the forefront of its field, the museum must have an outstanding professional staff and must periodically reevaluate itself, responding to the new ideas and initiatives with insight, imagination, and intelligence. The process of reevaluation is mandated by the museum's tradition, which encourages openness and a willingness to evolve and change. In sum, the Museum of Modern Art seeks to create a dialogue between the established and the experimental, the past and the present, in an environment that is responsive to the issues of modern and contemporary art, while being accessible to a public that ranges from scholars to young children. In my experience, this is one of the longest mission statements I've ever seen and read, and it reads almost like a legal document, so I thought I'll present it to you in its entirety. Let's begin. The museum is place. It is tempting, but maybe useful, to begin by reading the museum's history as a sequence of growth of its physical location. And I want to give a very quick outline of this. Maria already showed you this picture, which is the first building in which the museum opened. A few rented rooms in the Heckscher office building on 5th Avenue and 57th Street, a few blocks north of its current location. After 3 years, in 1932, the museum moved to a small townhouse, or maybe not so small townhouse, at 11 West 53rd Street, which is still its current address. So basically, by 1932, we are established in the place where we are today, and from that point on, we just slowly encroach upon the block. In 1939, the first of a series of dedicated buildings was completed, designed by architects Edward Durrell Stone and Philip Goodwin. The empty lot behind the building, and I show you just a couple of images. I like this, as if like a plane flies by over Manhattan and can read the address of the museum. Its entrance. The empty lot behind the building eventually became the sculpture garden, and rushing to celebrate its first gala, Barr and the architecture curator John McAndrew decided to devise a temporary system of display. I think they're beautiful. They're sort of like a beach pavilion or something. To present the sculptures in various dedicated areas, until Philip Johnson designed the formal sculptural garden in 1953, which is still pretty much the basic shape that it is today. For nearly 30 years, this was the facility of the museum until a series of expansions began, beginning with Cesar Pelli's Museum Tower in 1984, which you see in the center of this slide, and then again with Yoshio Taniguchi's most recent expansion in 2004, which resulted in the configuration that you may or may not know today. If you've ever been there, this is what you will see. And if you've followed, this is a few images. This is a view of the sculpture garden in the opposite direction. And some views of the galleries where the relationship between exterior views, views into the city and the garden, as well as these sort of long views down the sequence of galleries is emphasized. Some of you have already followed the discussions about another round of proposed expansions to cover the last open lot on the west end of MoMA's campus on 53rd Street by architects Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. And I'm just showing two current renderings of their design proposal, which coincidentally also, at least in the proposed stage, has a glass curtain wall that opens from the ground up. I think there must be a trend in architectural museum design for big chunks of the wall that glide up and open the museum up to the ground floor. More importantly, maybe, the idea of the museum as program has been absolutely central to the mission of the museum. From the beginning, Alfred Barr had a concept for the programmatic direction of the museum that was developed in relation to a reading of modernism based on an integration of disciplines: architecture and design, film, photography, and the more conventional disciplines of painting and sculpture, drawings and prints. His theories about chronology and influence, origins and invention, progression, and what might count as masterworks in this context were relentlessly explored, both in a series of groundbreaking exhibitions, as well as through a broad, aggressive, and ambitious collecting process. In this context, I find it useful to remember that many of the early programmatic exhibitions, from the very first show at MoMA focusing on the four foundational masters for the museum, Gauguin, Seurat, Van Gogh, and Cézanne, to the 1930, and we've seen these slides already, to the 1932 exhibition on international architecture, which coined, at least in the United States, the term international style, as well as the 1936 exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art, for which Alfred Barr developed his famous chart, took place in the modest quarters of the Heckscher building in the first MoMA townhouse. The 1938 Bauhaus exhibition was relegated to a temporary location in the Rockefeller Center concourse, the equivalent of an underground shopping mall, if you will. One could argue that by the time MoMA opened the 1939 building, its function from an intellectual programmatic upstart to an institution that was actively and ambitiously proposing a narrative for the development of modern art was well underway. And with the new building, it shifted from the groundwork of the early exhibitions to an increasingly ambitious collecting activity, exemplified here by the 1939 acquisition of Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, I think until today one of the sort of foundational pictures in the intellectual foundation of the museum. One could say that by 1940, as this graphic humorously illustrates, MoMA was a cultural machine, engaged in all levels of research, preparation, handling, exhibition, collection, display, education, and distribution of modern art in all media, as well as the modern functions of donor cultivation and gastronomy. You have a penthouse club room to be used by the members and guests already in this slide from 1940. So I propose, and this is very much my reading, that in the post-war period, MoMA's focus shifted in its exhibition activities outward. Of course, it continued staging monographic exhibitions, it continued staging thematic exhibitions, it continued very actively with a collection program, but it also very ambitiously developed a series of exhibitions that I just want to skip through here very quickly. Since its inception in 1952, MoMA's international program served as an important distribution network for the museum's point of view on modern art, sending artworks and exhibitions, scholars and curators abroad, and bringing them to the US. The brainchild of Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, president of MoMA, and René Darnancourt, its director at the time, the international program was a diplomatic mission and a proselytizing sermon, and it was extremely successful in distributing MoMA's idea of modernism worldwide. And this is a map of the world in which MoMA has sent exhibitions already by the 1950s. I'm just going through a number of slides that progressively show the sort of global reach. This is a Jackson Pollock painting being put on a ship to go to Sao Paulo, where it was exhibited in '57. The exhibition of modern American painting on a truck in New Delhi. Design Today in India, as well as The Family of Man, which I think toured the entire world over various exhibitions and also came to Russia. So I found a picture of The Family of Man in Belgrade, and demonstrations in Rome against The Family of Man, which was perceived to be communist. Thirdly, I want to look at something that might strike us as curious in the context of MoMA. From the beginning, especially in the early years, the museum was surprisingly flexible in its interpretations of what its function was in presenting a quote-unquote modern view, tied directly to the vision and force of its founding director. This modern view is as much about modern art as it is about using modern art as a filter to see the world. As early as the mid-1920s, as Richard Meyer has recently elaborated in his studies of Barr's course at Wellesley, that he taught in the spring semester of 1927 and the fall semester of 1928, he promoted an idea of modern art that could include shop windows and cars, factories and films, ballet and dollar store items. Bracketed by these two classes was a long trip that Barr took to Berlin and to Moscow, and I'm showing you a page of Barr's Moscow diary, which I find interesting because the text has been reproduced several times, but rarely with the images, where you see the clippings and get a little bit of the sort of graphic texture that Barr was interested in, including this little program note on Battleship Potemkin. At MoMA, this experience led crucially to the development of the different curatorial departments, which in the 1930s was a radical act to place photography and architecture and film on equal footing with painting and sculpture, as well as a series of exhibitions that presented art that could not even remotely be called modern in the narrow sense. An exhibition on prehistoric cave painting, an exhibition of masterworks from the Italian Renaissance, an exhibition of Native American art, and there are Navajos making sand paintings in the middle of MoMA, as well as the presentation of a shoeshine stand that Barr had seen on the streets of New York and brought to the museum during the Christmas season of 1942-1943. So this is where my presentation ends in regards to the history of MoMA. And I think what this presents to us today as staff working at the museum, a really open question as to how do we engage with an outside? How do we reverse this sort of proselytizing reach that the museum had in the 1950s? And about a decade ago, that idea was started by the idea that we should engage with the outside world with a larger narration of what various other modernisms exist there through a series of these sort of primary document anthologies. I'm showing you here the primary document source book on Eastern and Central European art, which about 12 years ago was edited by Laura Hopman and Thomas Poschbichir. And I want to end with the slide of our current initiative, Post, which is tied to a multi-year, multi-region research program that spans all departments at the museum. And I'm a member of the one that looks at art in Eastern Europe. And one outcome is this website where we're trying to bring together a lot of the research that we have been doing. So if you haven't been there, that's a place to take a look at.